Hey everyone, this is a really tragic story about betrayal. Make sure to listen all the way to the end, leave a like, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. She received an email with no subject and no sender at 7 in the morning, just as the kettle began to sing, and her husband's phone lay face down on the table, as always. Inside the email was only one file and audio recording, 12 minutes and 47 seconds long. She pressed play, expecting nothing. Maybe spam, maybe an ad, and heard her own voice. Brighter, lighter than it had been in months. She heard herself laugh, say, "Half an hour, like always," and a man's unfamiliar voice answer, "Like always." And in that moment, her morning, her kitchen, her home, her ordinary world turned into scenery for a play that had been running behind her back. She stood barefoot on the cold tile, realizing this wasn't a phone call. It was a recorder, placed nearby, too nearby. So close she could hear the sound of her elbow brushing against a porcelain cup, the same one her husband had given her on their 3rd anniversary. Her throat filled with dry dust, the kind silence is made of. She paused the audio at 8 seconds, then pressed play again and listened to the end. Because you can't live without finishing the movie where you play the main role and betray yourself. The word betrayal wasn't spoken once, but it hummed under every "like always," under every breath, under every second. When the file ended, she clicked on the sender, nothing. The timestamp late last night. The same night she'd said she was working late. She had indeed, just not at work. She'd stayed late in someone else's light, in someone else's attention. Her husband walked into the kitchen at 7:12, right on time. Kissed the top of her head without looking, right on time. Poured himself coffee and asked, "You good?" The way people ask about the weather, not expecting an answer. In his, "You good?" There were 2 years of fatigue, routine, and trust. Trust she had just converted from living to digital form. She said, "Yeah," because sometimes the body says yes before the soul has any words to lay on the table and set on fire. He went to shower, leaving his phone on the nightstand face down, of course. Every home has its own way of not looking truth in the eyes. She played the recording again, trying to remember when it all began. But there wasn't one day. It was 42 small, unremarkable days. 42 moments when she said later instead of now. 42 evenings when she asked, "Do you hear me?" and got a yeah through a phone screen. 42 mornings when he left before her alarm rang. 42. "It's fine, I'll survive." That slowly built a new kind of spine, flexible but fragile. The other man entered her life quietly, like a draft through an open window. At first, it felt like he was just letting air in, not stealing warmth out. He asked her what she used to dream about before she became convenient. He listened without interrupting. He noticed how she held her spoon when she was nervous, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she laughed. In those observations, there was no hunger, only respect. And that respect was the seed of disaster, because respect requires honesty, and honesty was what she lacked. She told herself it was just friendship, gratitude for someone who saw her when she couldn't see herself. She promised not to cross the line and kept redrawing it, moving it, renaming it, tracing it like a dotted path through her days. Until one day, she crossed it without even noticing her foot found the step on its own. It happened on a Friday. The city smelled like rain and gasoline. The other man said, "Don't stay if you don't want to." And she stayed. Not because she wanted to destroy something, but because she was tired of disappearing. That night wasn't wild or drunken. It was quiet, like a conversation that should have happened years ago, only with the wrong person. In the morning, she looked at her hands. They seemed different. Not because they'd touched someone else's skin, but because they'd finally touched her own truth. She came home, cooked lunch, looked at her husband, and realized she still loved him, but differently. Love had taken a seat in the second row, giving way to responsibilities. And once love sits down, it rarely stands again. They kept pretending. That's the right word. Pretending doesn't lie. It just keeps acting until the audience stops clapping. They shared bills, grocery lists, parenting duties, smiled at family gatherings, argued over nothing just to check if the spring still worked, but it had rusted long ago. Then came that morning email like someone backstage had called cut, turned off the stage lights and flipped on the cleaning lamp. Not for drama, but for cleanup. And now she stood at the kitchen sink, realizing the cleaning would be hers to do. Her husband came back, towel around his neck, sat down, and completely off script said, "Let's have dinner tonight, just us. No phones. I miss you." In that one miss you was everything that could have saved them if it had come 2 months earlier. For a moment she felt the two paths of her life, the one with him and the one without, almost touch. If she reached out now, maybe she could redirect everything. But the phone with the email lay on the table, and the dust in her chest rose again. She said, "Okay," already knowing the evening wouldn't survive the truth. The day dragged slow, heavy, honey-thick. Work blurred. Words stuck. At the door that evening, she hesitated as if at a border crossing with no passport. Then stepped in. He'd lit candles, sliced cheese, poured wine, nervous like he used to be years ago. Then he set the knife down, looked at her and said, "I got the same email." Her heart dropped so far she couldn't process the meaning at first. He pressed play. The same recording, the same 12 minutes and 47 seconds of her laughter, her like always, his unfamiliar voice. She didn't feel anger or guilt or tears, only shock. That someone else, a stranger, had decided how their truth should come out and in doing so, had taken away her right to confess. He stopped the recording halfway, sat back, picked up his glass but didn't drink. "I'm tired of living next to someone who disappears when I look at her," he said. He didn't ask who. He didn't count how many times. He didn't give a speech about morality. He spoke about what they'd both lost, her silence and his exhaustion, about how they had both become synonyms for the word later. He said he hated his, yeah, and she hated her, it's nothing. There was so much truth in that moment that the recording itself felt fake. She said, "It's my fault." For the first time without mirrors, excuses, or buts. And that fault didn't need judgment. It was the key to a room they hadn't cleaned in years. He nodded, not with victory, but with weary understanding, like people who swim to shore, only to realize the shore isn't theirs anymore. They talked for hours, calmly. Not because there were no emotions left, but because emotions had already burned out, like the candles on the table. He confessed his fears, how he'd been afraid to say he was unhappy, because in his family men don't say that. She confessed her hunger to be seen and how she had mistaken attention for love. He admitted he'd once thought about an affair too, but stopped at the door, and hated himself for being proud of that, because even pride felt cheap now. By the end, they weren't a couple or enemies, just two people who had finally dragged their truth into the light and saw how fragile their house had always been. They decided to live apart, not as punishment, not out of spite, but because sharing a bed when hearts live elsewhere is its own kind of lie. He packed a bag and left for a friend's place. She stayed in the quiet. But this silence didn't suffocate. It breathed, like the air after a storm. The other man texted, "How are you?" For the first time in months, she didn't answer right away, because she realized he wasn't a refuge. He was a mirror, and you can't build a home out of a reflection. She spent a month alone, talked to a therapist, learned to put her voice where the dust used to be, stopped confusing "I love you" with "I'm afraid to be alone," stopped mistaking attention for connection, stopped calling silence care, learned to tell her son, "I'm tired," not as a victim, but as a person who knows her limits. She and her husband met on weekends, in the park, talked about school, movies, money, and sometimes about themselves, without trying to fix, without trying to hurt. Those meetings felt like clear water after a long thirst, not because they brought happiness, but because they no longer poisoned it. At their son's school concert, when he stumbled over a piano note, her husband leaned over and whispered, "You've got this." The boy steadied himself and played on. And she thought maybe love doesn't have to survive a marriage to still be real. Sometimes it survives in respect, in honesty, in holding someone steady when the notes tremble. The other man called again. She answered, thanked him for the light he had once turned on, but said that light wasn't hers anymore. Because every light casts a shadow, and she was done paying for her brightness with someone else's darkness. 6 months later, she and her husband signed the papers. No drama, no war, no show. Just two adults accepting their share of growing up. They walked out together. He asked if she was cold, handed her a scarf. She smiled. "No," she said. "I can keep myself warm now." That evening, she found that same email in her archive and pressed delete. Not out of anger or fear, but the way you close a browser tab after reading everything you needed to. That night, she didn't make promises. No, never again. No, from now on. Life doesn't love promises. It loves attention, presence, honesty. She sat by the window, poured herself tea, called her mom, said, "I'm okay." And for the first time, it was true. Months later, she and her ex met again, this time on purpose, to choose a summer camp for their son. They argued a little, like old times, but now the argument wasn't about being right, it was about doing right. And she realized, when people stand for their truth, not for their wounds, the world becomes safer. That night, before sleep, she heard her own laughter again, not the stolen one from a recording, but her real one, unrecorded. And she thought, voice is always a choice where to send it. And now, she would send hers to the places where she doesn't need proof that she's being heard. The 12-minute, 47-second audio stayed in the past, like a photograph of a moment they'd both left behind. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as people who'd said later for too long and finally chose now.